So I wanted to have a guest on this morning, and we're joined by Kevork Almassian. Hey, Kevork, how you doing?
Hey, I'm good. How are you doing?
Good. So, one of the reasons I wanted you on, Kevork, and know what, you're in Germany, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So Kevork, and again, Kevork's somebody I interviewed when I was in Lebanon in 2013. So five years ago now. By the way, Kevork, I just found that interview that I did with you. I'm going to be posting some of that.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was very, very, very interesting reconnecting with Kevork. But one of the things, so Kevork, when I'm looking at the Western media, the United States media, even Germany, England, on this latest skirmish that happened at the Golan Heights, I'm seeing different versions of the story than I'm seeing when I look at other people who are pro-Syrian.
Well, I'm actually seeing different versions depending on which one I read. One of them says they strike Iranian targets in Syria. Then the next one says they traded fire with the Syrian troops. I mean,
so Kevork, what do you know about this, and how do you know it? I'm very curious where you go for information on stuff like this.
Actually, there is an intention to portray the current escalation in Syria as if it is an Iranian-Israeli conflict. We have to know that if we check the timeline of the Israeli strikes since 2011, Israel conducted hundreds of strikes in Syria, and the vast majority of the strikes were against Syrian army positions, and even before the involvement of the Iranian advisors or the Hezbollah fighters in Syria. So this is nothing new for us. But portraying the conflict as if it is an Iranian-Israeli conflict has a goal behind it. The goal is that Donald Trump withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal, and Netanyahu did this theatrical play trying to convince the world that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. So there is a growing intention to isolate Iran again in the region and impose sanctions, and this needs an excuses to take such a step, especially that most of the European partners of the United States, they refused to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. Now, in my opinion, what Donald Trump did is, by withdrawing from the deal, he has two options on the table. One is a military escalation against Iran, which is, I rule out this option because the results will be very devastating on the allies of the United States and the United States bases in the Middle East. So I am one of the, I believe that the second option, which is more rational, that Donald Trump will, by withdrawing from the deal and by saying that Iran is threatening the security of Israel, he will open again the file of the Iranian nuclear deal and try to negotiate once again over other details in the Iran nuclear deal to make it more comprehensive. For example, to include the Iranian ballistic missiles in the Iran nuclear deal, and also the issue of the Iranian growing influence in the Middle East. In 2015, the deal only included the centrifuges and also some of the hydrogen bombs of Iran program, and it didn't include the rest of the issues. Now, Donald Trump is trying to include more articles in this agreement, in my opinion, but the Iranian side will refuse to engage in such a negotiation. So hard days are waiting the Middle East in general and Syria in particular, because the Israelis will not, in my opinion, stop from conducting strikes against Syria and try to blame the Iranians for the retaliation, although I guarantee you that the missiles that been launched yesterday from Syria, there were over 50 missiles against Israeli positions in the occupied Golan Heights, were all Syrian missiles. None of them was Iranian. None of the launchers were Iranian, and the air defenses were Syrian air defenses, the S-200, the Panzer S-1, and the Buk and other air defense systems. It was 100% Syrian Israeli confrontation, but Israel will not tell you this. Because, as I mentioned, they are raising the issue of the alleged Iranian threat to the Middle East, not only to Israel but also to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is playing also in the hands of Israel in this regard.
Well, let me just highlight one thing that you said. You mentioned that you think part of the goal on renegotiating the deal is to deal with Iran's growing influence in the region. And I will point out that the Trump administration actually put that out as a talking point in the past day. They said that the Iran nuclear deal didn't do anything to stop its influence in the region. Well, of course, that wasn't a goal of the deal.
Time, right.
It was the goal of it was to stop the nuclear program. So, in other words, they sidestepped the issue that clearly it was doing that. The IAEA has recognized that. But they, exactly what you just said, the Trump administration has brought up themselves.
Now, the other thing we hear is since Hezbollah had some gains in the Lebanese parliament, Israel has threatened military action there. They have threatened to assassinate the Bashar al-Assad. It sounds to me like with, say, a John Bolton and his ilk really getting a strategic a grip on U.S. foreign policy, that Israel kind of sees this as a green light for further military action. You know, if we're expanding military action in the Middle East, how far do you see this going? How far do you personally see Israel taking it? And I'm asking you, for your subjective opinion on that. How far do they go? Do they attack Lebanon again? Do they, actually move to, military expansion?
Everything is possible in these circumstances, especially that Israel at the moment is feeling that its security being threatened after the advancement of the liberation of eastern Ghouta, and now in Homs and Hama, where the Syrian army is cleaning these areas, and then all the eyes will be directed towards south, towards Daraa, where the proxies of Israel are fighting. Israel is panicking because the Syrian army and the allies will advance into Daraa, and that means there will be a direct touch between the Syrian army and the Israeli army. And we all know that the Syrian government, they never gave up on liberating the Golan Heights. So after these steps, there could be another operation to liberate the Golan Heights. And yesterday, the entire confrontation happened that the Syrian army retaliated on the Golan Heights, and the Golan Heights is occupied Syrian territories. So any strikes on these territories is considered an act of self-defense or an act of resistance to restore these territories under international law. However, will the Israelis conduct more strikes? I believe so. Yes, they will do more strikes, but will they go for ground operation? I rule out at the moment this possibility because yesterday, I believe even the most optimistic person or the most optimistic analyst couldn't predict that the Syrian side will retaliate with more than 50 missiles on Israel. And many of these missiles, News Arabic live coverage yesterday, I was seeing the Iron Dome failing to take down the Syrian missiles falling in the occupied Golan Heights. So, in my opinion, the Israeli side will take this calculation into consideration because they didn't expect a harsh retaliation from the Syrian side. Now, new equations of military confrontation being drawn because since 1974 there wasn't a major confrontation on the occupied Golan Heights between Syria and Israel. Now this disengagement agreement, maybe we should consider it dead after this confrontation, and all the possibilities are on the table. I hope that there won't be further, let's say, escalation. But if we see the timeline of the conflict in Syria and what we were saying since the beginning, that this is a proxy war in Syria and Israel is directly involved in this. Now, after defeating the proxies in Syria, the masters will intervene because their interest has not been achieved in Syria. Therefore, they have to do something in Syria. Speaking about the buffer zone by trying to promote the idea of a buffer zone in southern Syria, and especially near the borders with Dar'a, and also occupying the eastern shores of the Euphrates by the Americans, and now the French troops also arrived there. So all these developments on the ground indicate that even if the proxy war ended against these terrorist groups in Syria, there could be another sort of a war between military powers such as the United States, France, Israel, and on the ground we have Syrian army, we have Hezbollah, we have the Palestinian Al-Quds Brigade, and we have the Iranians and the Russians. So things, I'm not optimistic, and I don't think the peace will be restored to Syria anytime soon. Obviously, the parties involved in the Syrian conflict are keen to have the biggest share of the cake in the outcome of the war. And from the Syrian perspective, the Syrians are determined to fight to the end to liberate every inch of Syria from not only from the terrorists but also from the masters of these terrorists who are on the ground now occupying a big portion of the Syrian territories.
We're talking to Kevork Amassian. He is a Syrian journalist. Now, Kevork, you're from Syria, but when I was in Lebanon, when I met you in 2013, I talked to a lot of Christians over there, and you mentioned your brother's a Christian, and I don't think people in America, especially Christians, understand the way Christians in the Middle East look at Israel. In America, Christians generally love Israel. They love and agree. Anything Israel does is okay with them. But when I was in Lebanon, I didn't meet a single Christian. Now, I didn't meet one who was, and I talked to a lot of them who were in love with Israel. And religious things aside, what they told me was basically they said we'd like to like Israel, but there's a lot of problems. And even Christians in Israel had to shut down a church recently over the poor treatment that they're getting in Israel. So can you just explain a little bit what the reality is, especially since, as we said, Hezbollah just made big political gains. So first off, the political gains that they made in Lebanon, that was partially in a coalition with Christians, correct?
Yes.
And so what is your perspective on the way Christians in the Middle East, and particularly Lebanon and Syria, look at Israel?
When we ask the majority of the Christians in Syria and Lebanon, for example, the vast majority of them would have negative sentiments towards Israel for many objective reasons, including that even the Christian community in Israel, they are oppressed, and they have, especially those who are from the 1948 Palestinians, because there are many Christians among the Palestinians, and actually Jesus Christ came from and Palestine. So we have many Christians there suffering from the apartheid system. They're suffering from the Israeli oppression. But on the other hand, for example, since the beginning of the war in Syria, the Christians saw how Israel sided with the Islamist genocidal groups in Syria. And the Al-Qaeda, for example, on the borders with Israel, they get monthly salaries from Israel, and this is no more a secret. Israel confessed that. And even the UNDOF, the UN forces, said that there is a daily meetings between these so-called rebels, that they call them, and the Israeli side. And on the other hand, the Israelis, they are attacking the Syrian army, which is the only force protecting the Christians.
Well, and this is important, too. It's important to understand, just to emphasize what you said there. The Israelis are supporting the jihadists. They're specifically supporting Salafi jihadist fighters in that armistice zone, correct?
True.
Yeah. So, I mean, Garland, this is one of those things where I try to get this through to people in America that the perception they have is the result of a multi-billion-dollar propaganda campaign going on. When you see people like Haim Saban and Sheldon Adelson, when you see all the money that Mohammed bin Salman just spent here, it's working, and it's convinced a lot of people, including a lot of Trump supporters, because they're Republican. It's been designed to convince people of something that's not true. It's that this idea that Israel somehow, in other words, American Christians like Israel more than Israel seems to like.
People can't wrap the fact of the matter is people cannot wrap their minds around the truth that we are supporting jihadists, that the U.S. and Israel are supporting jihadists in Syria. Quick last question. We've only got a minute or so, but it is my understanding, it is my discernment right now that the Syrian army has pretty much defeated what they call the rebels, the jihadis. Would you say that part of the war is almost really over? Would you say that that's correct or incorrect?
I believe 90% of the war against the jihadi groups is over, and especially by connecting the major cities, Damascus, Homs, Hama, and now Aleppo together. The main two issues left are the issue of Idlib and the issue of Daraa, as I mentioned. And I just want to mention one thing very fast about Hezbollah. Hezbollah didn't win the elections, but they tried to portray that Hezbollah won the elections. It was the Hezbollah and its allies who won the elections, including a big bloc of Christians. The vast majority of the Christians are allied with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they have now a big portion of the parliamentary seats. So by portraying the victory in Lebanon as a Hezbollah win, it's also in Israeli propaganda in order to try to portray that it's the Hezbollah terrorist group that won on the government, whereas the Hezbollah is only one part of the coalition, and which is a big coalition, includes a lot.
Hey, Kevork, we are up against a hard break. Kevork Almasian, thanks so much for coming on this morning and explaining this again. People really need to wake up on this, Garland. Like I said, particularly, I'm a Republican, particularly Republicans on this. We got more coming up, 2 more hours, Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.